Okay, well, thanks very much for joining everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, which is the third in our series discussing competition in digital markets. Today we're going to be focusing on the topic of driving productivity growth in Australia, challenges and opportunities for digital business and regulation. Let me start by first briefly introducing our panellists. I think you all have their impressive bios on the invitation, so I'm not going to read those out. First of all, let me introduce Stephen King, who's a Commissioner at the Productivity Commission, amongst other things, and we're really pleased he's able to join us today to discuss the Productivity Commission's recent report on advancing prosperity. Stephen's joined by Luke Wainscote, who's a Senior Economist at Houston Kemp, and he'll be drawing on his experience applying economic analysis to a broad range of complex problems during our discussion today. Just as a housekeeping matter, we'll be discussing in detail the three topics in the invitation, but if we do encourage questions, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We'll be having time at the end for a Q&A session, and we'd love to have questions from the audience that we can put to our panellists. Before we get into the topics, I'll just run through a bit of scene setting, if you like. In February 2022, the then Treasurer requested that the Productivity Commission undertake an inquiry into Australia's productivity performance and provide recommendations on productivity enhancing reform. That was the second of a regular series undertaken at 5-yearly intervals, and the last one was completed in 2017. The terms of reference were pretty broad and requested that the scope of report include, but not be limited to, seven issues, which I'll just quickly run through for those who haven't had the opportunity to read the report yet. The first was to analyse Australia's productivity performance in both the market and non-market sectors, including an analysis of the settings for productive investment in human and physical capital and how they can be improved to lift productivity. The second was to identify forces shaping Australia's productivity challenge as a result of COVID. And the third also related to COVID, considering the opportunities created for improvements in productivity as a result of Australia's COVID experience, especially through changes in Australia's labour markets, delivery of services such as retail, health and education, and digital adoption. The fourth was to identify priority sectors for reform, including but not limited to data and digital innovation and workforce skills, and to benchmark Australian priority sectors against international comparators to quantify required improvement. The fifth was to examine factors that may have affected productivity growth, including domestic and global factors, and an assessment of the impact of major policy changes, if relevant. The sixth was to prioritise and quantify the benefit of potential policy changes to improve Australian economic performance and the wellbeing of Australians by supporting greater productivity growth, and to set out a roadmap for reform. And the seventh was to revisit key recommendations and themes from the previous 5-yearly review. The report was released publicly in March of this year, and not surprisingly, it's extensive. It goes to 9 volumes with 29 recommendations. We're not going to attempt to cover all of that in today's discussion. Instead, today we're going to focus on volumes 3 and 4 of the report. Volume 3 deals with a competitive, dynamic and sustainable future. It recognises that much of the productivity improvement will be determined by decisions of businesses, and so the institutional, regulatory and tax environments in which businesses operate need to be conducive to productivity enhancing changes. And it notes that governments can influence this environment through changes to policy settings for competition, trade and investment activity. Volume 4, which we're also going to be discussing today, looks at Australia's data and digital dividend, examining opportunities for Australia to get more value out of its data holdings by enhancing the secure use in developing innovative new products and services and improving productivity of service delivery. With that introduction, I'm going to hand over to Stephen for some introductory remarks about the report.
Okay, so thanks, Kirsten. Yeah, one thing I will correct, we had 29 reform directions. We actually had 71 recommendations.
Okay.
We grouped them together to try and really help the government digest what was just a huge number of recommendations, a huge number of findings. The fact that we still ended up with 29 reform directions, I guess, suggests that we either failed in trying to simplify, or it just suggests the breadth of the issues that we need to discuss when we're doing a productivity inquiry. So it is 9 volumes. We cover off competition, regulation, investment, technology, innovation and diffusion of new ideas, climate transition, labour markets, education, over those 9 volumes. And if you really get excited, you can read the 9th volume, which is the economic modelling. I guess that the 2 key messages to take from, how you summarise those 9 volumes is that productivity growth is incredibly important for the welfare of Australians. If we look at what's occurred over the last 120 years, since the early 1900s, economic output, the amount of things that we have gone up by about 7-fold, whilst at the same time we're working approximately 10 hours less per week for each full-time employee. So what productivity really means is that we're able to get more by doing less. As a country, we've achieved that in Australia, and pretty much every country in the world, certainly all the developed countries and many of the middle-income countries, have achieved that over the last 120 years. It means people have been brought out of poverty. It means countries make a choice. So some countries have taken a bit more leisure and a bit less things, and we present a few examples of that. Australia has tended to be more on the side of taking more things and a bit less leisure than some of our European colleagues. But really it's a benefit that can spread over the entire economy, and it's really the basis for our wealth. What's the problem then? Well, the problem really is that if we look at the last 60 years, for example, productivity in Australia is at its lowest level over the last 60 years. So if we took the 60-year average productivity growth level, it's about 1.7% per annum. We're currently, over the last 10 years, running about 1 to 1.1%. Now, that may not sound like much. You sort of say, hey, it's only 0.6% less than that 60-year average, but it compounds up into a huge amount. So, think about Australia today. If we'd been able to maintain over the last 10 years that higher average productivity growth level, then we'd be talking about a 6% gain in GDP. That's getting up towards $5,000 per person extra that we would have. Now, again, you can take that as things, you can take that as leisure, but that's what's on the line. So really, the focus of our report was to ask, why has productivity dropped? And how do we go about changing it, getting back to where we would like to be as an economy? So the first one, just on the why part, we're not alone in this. This is an issue that has occurred right across the developed world. So if you think of the OECD countries, that group of richer developed countries, the sort of productivity drop that we've seen in the last 10 years has occurred right across the OECD. We did a bit better in the 1990s than many of our developed economy comparators, but since then we've come back to the pack. So this is a problem over the entire developed world, I should say. Why? Probably the key thing to understand here is that our economy now is completely different to what it was 60 years and certainly 100 years ago. We now have an economy that is very much service dominated. So if you look at the Australian economy, if you go back when I was a kid, I'm old, so it's a long time ago, but you used to have Australia's lives on the sheep's back. Well, no one says that anymore, but we still have this idea of ourselves, well, we're a mining and agricultural superpower, and that's part of the Australian ethos. It's not true. Mining makes up about 10% of our gross domestic product. Agriculture and manufacturing together make up another 10%. 80% of our economy is services. 90% of our employment is services. The big increasing area is what the ABS politely calls non-market services. They're the things like health, education, where governments often involve funding. They're certainly intimately involved in setting up the systems, regulating the systems, controlling the systems. So one of the reasons why productivity has dropped is because we don't see the same sort of productivity improvement in both service sector and particularly in the non-market services as we traditionally saw in, say, manufacturing, mining and agriculture. But that's the diagnosis. That doesn't actually answer the why question. Why? So if we go back further, one of the claims that's been put out by economists is that the problem is all the easy innovations being done. The big innovations that we saw around the late 1800s through the 1900s, through the 20th century, they were all, they were big bang for the buck innovations. And what we're seeing now, the internet, hey, we have Facebook and Twitter and so on, but the view is that perhaps they're just not as important. I'm not sure that's true. We've seen huge technological change over the last 30 years. We've all lived through it, but we don't see that in the productivity numbers. So another explanation might be mismeasurement. Are we just not measuring the right things? Are we getting that measurement wrong? Another one is demographics. We're an older society. Most developed countries are ageing populations. And so part of a reason may be that older people like me, we're less entrepreneurial, we're less risk-taking, and maybe that demographic change has got something to do with it. And the final one, which I think we're going to come back to, particularly later on in this webinar to talk about, is there is a view that, well, something's gone wrong with competition, that we've had declining competitive and economic dynamism in our economies. So what do we mean by that? Well, there's less job turnover, there's less entry and exit of firms. There's a view that frontier firms are still pushing ahead, but there's many more laggard zombie firms, they're sometimes called, in our economy. Business investment has dropped, which has occurred. Concentration, it's argued, has gone up. Markups, it's claimed, has gone up. So there's certainly a push, and we've seen it in the antitrust debates in the US and in the EU, to say the problem is productivity's down because competition's down. And at best, I would say that's a partial answer to the productivity problem, and certainly not the underlying or the key ones that Australia needs to worry about. But that's a bit of an overview of what we've got in that report.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Luke, do you want to make any introductory comments before we get into the topics?
Sure, thanks, Kirsten. Yeah, so as Kirsten and Stephen said, the focus of the Productivity Commission is obviously on the productivity of the Australian economy. The hint is in the name of the report and the organisation. So one question is, how important is productivity and what are the limits of focusing on productivity? So like Stephen said, it's important if we want to be better off for a given amount of work, but productivity doesn't measure everything. So people's happiness or the state of the environment. And there are lots of benefits that technology might have given us that are not accounted for in the measurement of productivity, like being able to work from home, being able to avoid the worst traffic, video call my family on the other side of the world. You can access information. So productivity is important, but when we're thinking about it, we need to remember that it's not everything.
Stephen, do you agree productivity isn't everything?
Perhaps I'll pick Paul Krugman's words and say, well, productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it is almost everything. So yeah, Luke's completely right that there's more to life from productivity, but productivity is pretty well correlated with many of the things that we care about. So, and you'll see some of this evidence picked up in the productivity report. So if we look at things, measurements that we consider well-being type measurements. So longevity, one of the revolutions of the last 120 years is the increase in life expectancy in most countries. So when we see that certain groups in the US are starting to have decreasing life expectancy, we say, oh my God, something's gone terribly wrong for that to occur. We expect life expectancy to keep on rising along with that productivity because it is a consequence of productivity. Having not simply more stuff and less hours work, but a quality of work, so that the things that used to kill people in workplaces, just don't happen anymore. If you remember the old film On the Waterfront, where manually packing ships, an incredibly dangerous activity, that's gone. Why is it gone? Well, because of improvements in technology and productivity through shipping containers. The old way of loading ships just doesn't happen anymore. Infant mortality has plunged throughout the developed world. So children are surviving longer, and that's leading to changes in demographic patterns. You no longer have to have women, don't have to have 6 or 7 children to try and make sure that 2 survive into adulthood. That sort of change has helped improve female labour force participation, which again, just an improvement in quality of life. So if you look at life satisfaction across countries, you look at GDP, you correlate the two, gee, there's a close relationship. I'm not sure there's too many people who would say, yeah, look, take my productivity away and let's go, I don't know, to sub-Saharan African standards of living. Now, not everything works, so inequality is a lot less closely related to productivity growth. And the US, again, tends to be a bit of an outlier there. Very good productivity growth historically, but some of the higher levels of inequality among the developed world. And of course, there's other stuff like, working from home, which just highlights the measurement problems we have. Of course, working from home means that you consume less public transport, less car service and so on, which formally reduces GDP. And most people sort of say, no, I'm better off by being at home and not being required to consume those things, but will really cost me getting to work. So I take Luke's point. I'm far from convinced.
All right. Well, now let's get into the 3 topics. Let's start with the first topic, which is what policymakers should take from the Productivity Commission's report to ensure regulatory frameworks are fit for purpose in the 21st century. I'm going to go first to you, Luke. What do you think?
Thanks, Kirsten. So, firstly, I'd say that the thing that policymakers should do is to actually read and take account of the Productivity Commission's report. So it's extremely detailed and thorough. I'm not sure I've ever actually come across a report that's more than 1,000 pages before, maybe a new benchmark. But it's, based on the best available economics we have right now and the facts on the ground. But the report itself, I'm afraid, does nothing. So the action comes from government actually using the report. So there are plenty of reports sitting on shelves, gathering dust, waiting for the government to ask for another report of a similar nature. So I guess, anyway, my first thought is, well, the government should actually read it and do something about it. But putting that aside, I think at least in volume 3, there's 3 sensible suggestions about regulatory frameworks. So the first one is that regulatory policy should take account of how severe the harms might be from some conduct or products. And the second is that policymakers should aim for neutrality across business models, not favouring one over another. And last, there are just some good principles of regulation that are sort of quite well known that should be applied. So just taking the first one, like Stephen said, there's new technologies have provided a huge benefits to us, and they can provide more benefits for us. So we want them to flourish and to be used as much as possible. But we also have to strike a balance between those benefits and potential harms they can bring. And what the PC says is that the important thing is we should think about what's the worst that could happen. So we need a stricter ex ante sort of approach to regulation when the bad outcomes are really bad. So that means we could perhaps have a regulatory sandbox approach where new regulations, tested out in real time when the worst outcomes are not that bad, like paying slightly too much. But it means that we should have stricter regulation if the outcomes are that people might be killed. So, for example, an autonomous vehicle could kill someone. So we're really got to make sure those are regulated before they're sort of used. We don't want regulation on the fly in that one. So if we apply that approach, we might be able to, for the regulation of digital platforms, for example, we might be able to have a regulatory sandbox approach, because the harm to consumers, if any, don't appear to be that severe. In fact, we're in the world right now without any regulations. So yeah, the second point is we need to be neutral across different business models. So we don't want to favor new or old ways of doing things. I feel like maybe rideshare was an example where they actually got a bit of a free ride, for example, for a while, because taxi companies were sort of regulated a bit more heavily than them. Perhaps not the case now, but we, as much as we can, we want to have level playing field. And yeah, the last thing is just good old-fashioned principles of regulatory design. So it seems like every time a new technology comes along, people want to rethink regulation when we really don't need to. We've got some principles that have been stood the test of time. So yeah, this is not exactly rocket science, but if you're thinking about a new regulation, you should set out the policy problem, explain why government action is needed, set out the different possible options, set out their costs and benefits, and say why the one you've chosen is the best. And yeah, it might not be that new, but that approach can be applied to all new technologies, like AI and anything else, which is coming soon.
Stephen, I'm sure you agree with Luke that everybody should actually read the report. What do you think policymakers should take from it specifically to ensure regulatory frameworks are fit for purpose?
Yeah, so let me start just by responding to Luke. Luke's right that regulators, governments need to think about the risks of technology in advance and make sure that the regulations are fit for purpose, that they're risk-based. I would say that's very hard. So one of the benefits of being on a webinar is I quickly looked up, when did Alan Fels put out his Victorian taxi report? Well, it was 2012. If you go back and look at that report, I think it probably does not mention ride sharing. Within 2 to 3 years, ride sharing was basically eating the lunch of the taxi industry, and all of Alan's recommendations were completely irrelevant because the industry had been transformed by ride sharing. So these things can happen very fast. We need to have frameworks for thinking about them. That's a lot better than a gut reaction when something goes wrong, but that is not easy. Let me pick one that we highlight in the report, which is cybersecurity. A lot of discussion around cybersecurity at present, but it's very easy for governments to respond, as I think they're doing at the moment, which is to say, oh my God, there's a data hack at company X. We need tougher cybersecurity laws. There must be more reporting by companies. There must be more red tape that companies have to jump through. This must be required of companies. So the debate goes from being, well, how do we manage the risks? Who is bearing those risks? because the first question should be, what's the risk is to the company and the consumers of a particular company. Are there spillover costs that the company isn't facing from a data breach, from a lack of cybersecurity? That should be the first point before the government says, well, we've got to jump in with big, heavy boots. And if there is that spillover, if there's the broader cost of these sort of cybersecurity incidents, how do we get a proportionate response? So, and we talk about that because cybersecurity is one of those areas that, and this is in Chapter 4 of the Productivity Commission's report, where we are seeing a pretty heavy-handed response that may, it's probably great politics. It's great from a regulator's point of view. Regulators don't get congratulated when something goes right. They only get kicked around when something goes wrong. So the regulators love the heavy-handed response, but we've got to ask, what is the cost for business? So I think that's something we've got to be very concerned about. We've seen that in cybersecurity. I think we've seen that in the ACCC's digital platform reports. I think we've seen approaches there, and we can come back to those later on. But the 5th report, which is the one that really sets out that regulatory framework, seems to be out of all proportion with the potential risks. We see that in privacy. There's recently been a review of the Privacy Act. Again, in Volume 4 of the Productivity Commission report, we talk a lot about data. Data is this fantastic resource that we can use in Australia, and there's a lot of government data that we can use. But at the moment, the debate around data is being dominated by privacy. And privacy is important, but it's not the only thing that matters. And so let me give you a simple example of where we have the technology, but we're not using it to drive productivity. For example, in our health system. When you go to hospital, so say, Luke, I'll pick on you. Luke goes to grab a coffee after this, unfortunately walks in front of a bus, off to emergency. If he is still conscious, if not, they'll have to ask somebody else. The first question will be, what medicines are you on? That strikes me as completely bizarre, when almost all medicines that Luke is on will be known by the federal government through the pharmaceutical benefits scheme. So the government has one arm that keeps the information about what medicines Luke's on, but does not release that to the other arm, despite the fact it can save Luke's life. And medicine misadventure is one of the major causes of death in hospitals. There are so many examples, and we've run through some in the productivity report. We run through some in other reports, such as our mental health report, our chronic healthcare report, and so on, where using technology better literally saves lives. And we need to make sure that debate in Australia around data is much more balanced, so that we reflect, yes, privacy is important, but as I said, it's not the only thing that matters. So yeah, I think, hopefully read the report. I think there's a lot in there, but yeah, there are a couple of the things that jump to mind.
All right. Luke, did you want to add anything to that before we move to our next topic?
Yeah, not really. Just to sort of say, I think Stephen's right. Like, you do hear a lot more about, I hear more about problems with data and new technology than benefits. So my casual observation is we do seem to hear more about that, and that could lead to, an effect on productivity by people not using technology when they could. And perhaps we should be more positive in thinking of ways we can use it as opposed to being worried about it.
Right. Our next topic, just to keep moving, or we'll be talking about topic 1 all day, is the key factors to ensure Australia fosters investment and business dynamism to boost productivity growth. Again, this is a big topic, but I'm going to go first to you, Luke. What do you think?
Thanks, Kirsten. So yeah, well, the first thing, I think Stephen mentioned this before, but just a general fact is that business investment as a share of GDP has fallen. So it looks like we have a problem with investment, and this likely reflects a number of factors. This is in the PC's report, like the cost of capital, perceptions of risk, and the structural changes to the economy. I mean, like a lot of these things, it's complicated, but I think that it's common for people to say we need more investment, and like I said, we probably do. But before we say that, we actually not only want more investment, we want the most productive investment we can get by the right firms at the right time. So it's not only the case that we just want more of this stuff and that all investment is equally good. We want the best we can get by the right people at the right time. And the other thing is that, again, all these things are quite complicated, so we have to be a bit careful because we want investment to drive productivity, but maybe a lack of productivity is causing a reduction in investment. So we have to, fully understand why we have a low level of productivity, and that causation goes both ways, not just thinking about, oh, how can we boost investment, because maybe we've missed the point. Anyway, having said all that, if we do want to encourage investment, I mean, there are three things we can do. We can provide more of the return on the investment to the person who's doing the investing. And the second thing is we can just reduce the regulatory cost, or I think Stephen said the firms have to jump through the red tape. I thought we had to cut through the red tape, but anyway, jump through is fine. But yeah, less red tape to jump through, on just restrictions on business activity. And the third is to reduce the risk of investing by providing as much certainty as you can. So on the first one, I think it's mostly about the tax system. So we want to tax things. We don't want to be taxing things like investment because they're a good thing. They're an engine for growth, or they could be, and also because investment may be able to go overseas quite easily. So I mean, tax is not my sort of area of expertise, but basically from my sort of 101, I remember that we want to tax things we want to discourage, and you want to tax things that are not going to change a great deal if you tax them, to reduce the sort of deadweight loss. And obviously the second point is that we want to minimize the restrictions on companies, because that is more likely to mean it's profitable for them to make an investment. But of course, some regulations have a proper purpose. But I guess the challenge is just to make sure that the regulations that are there do actually do have a net benefit. And yeah, lastly, we want to provide as much certainty as possible. So regulatory uncertainty can be a real killer of investment, and it's one of the reasons we've got a bit of a low level of investment in renewables in recent years. So if we can give firms, it's not only about, it's not only just the amount of red tape, it's just the fact that, okay, this red tape is gonna stay there, and you might try and jump through. If you try and jump through this red tape, we're not going to put another red tape in the middle as you're jumping through. Anyway, so yeah, as much certainty as possible would be helpful.
Yep. Which I think is, Stephen's nodding vigorously. Over to you, Stephen.
Yeah, I'll jump in and respond. Yeah, so just to pick up a couple of points that Luke mentioned. Yeah, so we tend to, in Australia, because mining's such a big part of the investment story, we tend to focus on non-mining investment. Mining investment goes up and down with resource booms and so on, but that non-mining investment has dropped considerably. I mean, we're looking at about a 7% drop as a share of GDP since the 1960s. So that's a big drop. It's changed where the investment is occurring. So since the late 1980s, for example, the amount of manufacturing investment has dropped off considerably. A lot of the new investment is occurring in what's, again, euphemistically called other services. So it's not retailing, it's not wholesaling, it's not logistics, it's other business services in there. And again, that tends to reflect that we've had this change in our economy, but in many ways, government and certainly policy and just our measurement is lagging in those changes to the economy. We talk a bit about the tax system in the report, and agree with Luke on the importance of reforms there. We also talk, we've actually got a whole volume on reducing the cost of getting to net zero. We recognise net zero as a policy goal, but Australia has been, I'll go further than you did, Luke. I'll say Australia's been terrible at designing policies to reduce or to allow business to move towards net zero with certainty. And, you know, asking business to sort of do a bit of a policy lottery isn't the best way to achieve, or regulatory lottery isn't the best way to achieve that policy outcome. Another risk, though, that I think Luke didn't touch on, and we probably didn't touch on it a lot in our report, but I think it's probably post-COVID, it's a rising risk that we see to productivity, and that's the government's, and these are governments around the world, including Australia, their tendency to want to be more interventionist in industrial policy. So we've seen, certainly on the economic side, we've seen this resurrection of industrial policy, the idea that governments should take a much stronger hand in guiding and moulding where private business enterprise goes. And I think that certainly worries me. I think it worries the Productivity Commission. That doesn't mean that there aren't necessarily good reasons for some intervention in certain cases. So we've seen the US CHIPS Act, which is a response to fears that the semiconductor industry, which is largely based in Taiwan, is potentially subject to geopolitical forces that aren't in the US's interest. So the US has introduced or has had a bill which would significantly subsidise semiconductor manufacturers setting up plants in the US, and we're seeing that occur. Now, that all sounds good, except that when it's just done unilaterally by one country like the US, the EU then comes out with the European Chips Act, which says, well, we're going to double our share of the semiconductor production around the world in the next, or by 2030. And I think they put something like $76 billion behind it. Now, once you start getting those sort of inter-country industrial policy games being played, you end up just with really beggar thy neighbour policies. These do not improve productivity. All they do is disperse a lot of costly taxpayer funds to try and win business across to your country rather than somewhere else. If you remember pre-COVID, there was a great big fight to get an Amazon warehouse between a group of cities in the US, and they were putting literally hundreds of billions on the table to try and attract an Amazon warehouse. That is not great for business. You want business to locate where it is best suited for that business, where it's best connected into supply chains, not to be basically the result of a government bidding war. If anything, the COVID experience, the geopolitical disruptions, and the Chinese bans on some of our products from Australia is an example of that. The floods we had on Manulabor, all of those have shown that if they're allowed to be, our producers, domestic producers here in Australia and other companies around the world, are amazingly nimble and flexible at responding to those pressures. So, for example, I'll pick the Nullarbor one because it's just a great example of what can be done. So when they had the floods on the Nullarbor a few years ago, they changed overnight the domestic shipping regulations that make it very, very hard for particularly overseas ships, but even Australian ships, to ship materials between the east coast and the west coast of Australia. They got rid of those overnight. Ships came on within days, shipping stuff. Nobody in Perth died because of a lack of toilet paper. But that showed what can be done by the private sector when they're allowed. Unfortunately, floods went away and the regulation got put back on. So, I think that's a real issue that we need to think about. It goes back to Luke's point, to make sure that the regulation is fit for purpose, that it's risk-based, and that it's actually addressing a real problem rather than perhaps a short-term political problem.
Luke, did you want to add to that?
Well, the only thing is, it's a shame we don't have the WTO doing what they're supposed to do. Like, I always thought the WTO was supposed to stop this subsidies by various countries to bring in, industries to their country. But did Donald Trump sort of refuse to put people on the board of the WTO or something? And anyway, it just seems to be on the back burner.
So the WTO appeals board now has 0 members. I think the last member, their term finished a year or so ago. So the WTO can make any ruling it likes now. It is unenforceable because if the ruling is breached, there is nobody to appeal it to. So yeah, that was a result of the US policy under Donald Trump. But to be fair, it hasn't changed under the current administration either.
All right. Again, just to keep things moving, I think let's move to topic 3, which has 2 aspects. Although we just have had a question in the chat. We might keep the questions to the end, and let's move to topic 3, and then we'll go through the questions, even though they'll go back perhaps to topics 1 and 2. Topic 3 has 2 aspects: whether competition is declining and impacting productivity growth, and whether competition laws need reform to deal with emerging trends such as e-commerce and new technology-enabled business models. Luke, do you want to address one or both of those first?
Sure, thanks. Yes, I'll just talk about the first one. So firstly, there's this the straw argument. I'll set out the argument and then I'll sort of say what I think might be the problem with it. So with many kind of wise people, including economists in Australia and overseas, the ACCC and ministers have set out this same broad argument, essentially, that Stephen alluded to at the very beginning, that there's been an increase in concentration, and that's weakened competition in Australia over the last 20 years, and that's contributing to lower productivity and business dynamism. And some data that's been used to support that is that industry concentration at national level has increased. Estimates of profit margins have increased. That's a proxy for competition. And there are some measures of economic dynamism that have weakened, like job mobility, entry and exit, and business investment have fallen. So, yeah, I'll just talk about what I think are the problems with that narrative or argument. But firstly, I think Stephen wrote a paper recently about this in Economic Papers. So if you want more information, you can freely access that there. But I guess the other thing as an introduction is that this is not only something that academic economists are interested in, even though, of course, Stephen, that's important. It actually affects the direction and focus of regulatory and government policy, and drawing the wrong conclusion about the state of competition could easily lead the government down the wrong path to changes in policy and law, and sort of, they might ignore the right path. So yeah, the sort of 5 problems with this narrative are, firstly, that the measurement of concentration and margins and dynamism are inaccurate and could be completely wrong. And second, the changes to these indicators over the last 20 years are sometimes pretty small and not really at a level that you'd be normally worried about. Third is that the interpretation of changes to these indicators is a bit ambiguous. They're not necessarily good or bad. And fourth, there's the causal links between these indicators, that concentration, competition, and dynamism, are not very clear, they're not proven, and likely just way too simple for our messy reality. And last, that the economy-wide measurement and assessment of competition and dynamism just doesn't make sense because all markets are different and the relationship between these indicators is different from market to market. So I'll just go through those in a little bit more detail. So firstly, on the measurement, essentially for concentration, we don't know if it's going up or down. For competition, we don't know if it's weakening or strengthening. And for some of the economic dynamism variables, we do know they're moving. So just to take concentration first. So when people talk about concentration, what they usually do is they, at a macro level, they look at concentration across a whole industry on a national level. And the PC recently did this where it looked at concentration at the 3-digit SIC level across Australia and found it increased a little bit from 2003 to 2006 and then has been fairly static. But the problem is we don't usually measure concentration for the purposes of assessing competition in that way at an industry level. So one of the SIC codes used, for example, is recreational goods retailing. So that includes the retail of marine equipment, books, toys, games, media, sports, and camping equipment. So some of these just don't compete with each other and are sold in different shops. So it's probably not the right way to define a market, in which case it's not the right way to measure concentration, at least for the purposes of assessing competition. So that's the product side. But also from a geographic side, when people measure concentration, they do it at a national level. But competition occurs often at a local level. So, for example, between pubs and coffee shops. And it's possible the concentration is increasing at a national level, but falling at a local level. So when Bunnings opens a store in a local town, national level concentration would increase, but at the local level, it's just decreased. So unfortunately, we don't have information about concentration. So we don't really know if it's going up or not. Second one is margins. This is similarly bad, I guess. People have said that margins are increasing in Australia and in the US and in Europe, but what they really mean is estimates of margins have increased based on a number of assumptions, and we don't know how good those estimates are, and we don't know if those assumptions hold. So we don't actually know if margins are rising. And the reasons we don't know is that we can't observe marginal costs, and we often can't even observe prices. So what usually happens is they're estimated indirectly using something called the production approach. So I don't know if I want to go too far in the detail, but it's pretty complicated. But in short, if you stay with me, it's you calculate this by dividing an input's output elasticity by its share of revenue. And this should work if you have competitive input markets. That's one assumption, and firms are minimizing their costs. That's another probably pretty good assumption. But you need to know the production function to work out the output elasticity, which is how much output is changing when you change an input. So most economists assume that the capital labor ratio doesn't change as output increases, but this could just be completely wrong. On top of this, you need information on variable costs. We don't necessarily know what those are. They're taken from accounting data, and it's very difficult really to know what's fixed and what's variable. So essentially, there's just a lot of problems with it. And I guess the real problem is that no one has ever tested this against actual margins in Australia. So we just don't know whether they're good or not. But moving on to, well, some of the measures of economic dynamism we do know have changed, like exit rates, job mobility, and business investment have fallen. So it's not all bad. Yeah, the second point is that there's some of these variables, the changes that have been observed, even if they're correctly measured, are quite small. So the change that is measured in concentration in the Productivity Commission recent submission to an inquiry is actually pretty small in Australian context, and the level of concentration reached is also not that bad. And the measures of margins, some people say they've increased by 5% over 20 years, which again is maybe not that bad given the potential margin for error. So the third thing I mentioned was the interpretation of changes. So some of the measures of economic dynamism, we just don't know if we want more or less. So is more firm entry good, and is more job mobility good? We just don't know, because there's no obvious optimal level of job mobility for firm entry. What we know is we want people to move jobs when there is a more productive job for them, and we want people to create firms when they have the chance to create like a productive firm. But it's also possible that existing firms can expand into a sort of a hole left by others. So we just don't know whether more or less job mobility and firm entry is good or bad. And then the fourth point was about the causal links. So we don't know. There is a causal link between them. So even if it's true that concentration and competition are correlated, this doesn't mean there's causation between them. So I happen to know there's a very strong correlation between the number of complaints about barking dogs in Geelong and the number of insolvencies in Manly, but I really don't think there's a causation between the two. So this is a well-known fact. Correlation doesn't mean causation. So the idea that concentration is bad for competition goes back to the 1950s, the structured conduct performance paradigm. That was developed before all of us here were born, I think. But before I was born, and maybe others on the panel, economists had already recognized in the early 1970s that this causation that was put forward by the structured conduct performance paradigm wasn't actually one way. So if you have a more competitive market, low-cost firms can grow more quickly, and so you can get higher levels of market concentration. So competition can cause concentration as well as the other way around. And there's a bunch of reasons, well, lots of reasons why we might have more concentration these days. So we might have more competition for the market in digital markets where, you get a winner for a while, and then, there's a high level of concentration measured at that point, but then you get another winner and then another. Or you just have increasing economies of scale, which has been a finding from a recent paper in the US as a big cause of concentration. And lastly, I guess about the economy-wide measurement, I sort of feel like we might never get to a point where we measure this well, because I just don't think we can measure these things and analyze them at an economy-wide level, because concentration and competition vary, their relationship varies between markets and over time. And so if you look at concentration at an industry level, you find that some of them going up, some of them go down. They don't all move together. So, for example, we've probably all observed in the retail sector over the past 40 years, there's been a big increase in concentration because there's been greater use of economies of scale, more big box stores, entrance from overseas, and online shopping. So that's one of the cases where competition has helped cause concentration rather than the other way around. So I guess I sort of think that really what we should do is we should be looking at these markets at a sector or market level rather than sort of an economy-wide level. So I don't feel like, that's likely to be productive to look at it from an economy-wide point of view.
Thanks, Luke. Stephen, going to the first part of our topic, whether competition is declining and impacting productivity growth. Do you want to add anything or debate anything that Luke's just said?
Look, I largely agree with Luke's assessment. Luke mentioned a submission that the PC did. I've popped the link in the chat, so if people want to follow up on that. I think the easy way to summarise, and I call it this sort of failure of competition narrative, is that it's an attempt to come up with an easy solution to a complex problem. And the drop in productivity across the developed world is a complex problem. To say, oh, it's due to competition, it's a very US-centric argument based on, well, the Department of Justice and the FTC and the US didn't really, they weren't pursuing competition cases. I don't see any evidence of the European Commission not pursuing competition cases at the same time. So how do you explain that the same drop in productivity occurred there? The OECD, which some work from the OECD sort of was early on in this debate saying, oh, that gap between frontier firms and zombie firms, as they got called, the laggards. Recent work by the OECD's gone and looked at those laggards or zombie firms and has said, oh, actually, they're really complex and there's no easy answer. And, well, yes, certainly some of them are old firms that don't seem to be going too well, but some of them are behind the frontier because they're new firms and they're learning and they will catch up and they're going to be tomorrow's innovative winners. So, trying to do these easy stories is always dangerous. That's why we have 9 volumes and, as Luke says, over 1,000 pages. You cannot answer the productivity problem just by sort of saying, oh, here's the answer, it's competition, just get someone gung-ho enough to run your competition commission, you'll be right. Unfortunately, that's where the answers sometimes go. Now, that being said,
Stephen, people love a simple story.
Well, I agree, but the risk is, and you raise this risk, Luke, that it ends up with bad policy because it does 2 things. One, it sort of says, look here, here's the solution. Don't worry about all of it. Don't worry about the tax laws. Don't worry about cybersecurity or digital technology or any of that. You've just got to look at the competition. So that's one risk. The other risk is that you, of course, miss the real story. So should there be changes in competition? Well, yes, we've still got the Harper report, most of which is still sitting on the table. Not all of it, and I don't agree with all of it. I don't necessarily agree with all of it was implemented, but it hasn't been acted on. We have a judge coming out and saying that our cartel laws are like a cryptic crossword. That should be a call to arms to say these laws need reform. In our productivity report, we noted that the new Section 46, the abuse of market power laws, have been there since 2017. We're still saying the cases are coming to court. Well, hopefully we'll get some precedent now, but it is a worry that parties are already talking about, well, should we change our laws about abuse of market power when we have no precedent on extremely strong laws on abuse of market power that flowed out of Harper. On the mergers side, one of the things we comment in the report is that we have 3 different ways to get a merger clearance: direct to federal court, informal ACCC, formal ACCC. 3 different tests. The ACCC, certainly under its former chair, complained quite vociferously that they were being gamed. Well, okay, if you've got 3 different ways to get your merger cleared, don't be surprised if you're going to be gamed. My initial reaction, and I'll say this as a former mergers commissioner, the ACCC has huge power under that informal process. It doesn't tend to use its merger guidelines properly to say, look, cooperate, make sure we get the data, or guys, we're not informally clearing you. You can either try and get to the federal court. The federal court's going to get sick of that pretty quickly, or you can go down the formal route. Simple way the ACCC could have changed its own process to fix most of the problems. it's put forward some suggestions. Gina Cascott-Lieb, the current chair of the ACCC, put forward some ideas in the National Press Club talk. I think they're certainly worth considering. They're more formal than my approach, but they'll probably get to the same end. But the real risk that we've had here is just all of this stuff on failure of competition is a distraction that stops good policy rather than helping good policy.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Luke, I don't think I've given you the chance to express your view on the second part of the question, which is whether competition laws need reform at all, or to deal with emerging trends such as e-commerce and new technology-enabled business models. Do you want to just spend a short time giving your views on that part of the topic, and then we might move to questions?
Sure, yeah. So, well, in brief, yeah, I don't think we need to have any changes. That the competition law should be the same for all sectors, shouldn't be dependent on the sector. Of course, you might want to introduce regulation if you feel like firms have substantial market power, but you know, I think you want to have a level playing field, so you really want to have all firms facing the same laws rather than different laws for different companies. And I don't feel like you really need to change your competition law greatly over time just because there are new industries. Like Stephen said, you might want to improve some merger process you feel it's not really working, but I don't feel like a new industry means you need new competition law.
Stephen, I know we've discussed this before on previous webinars, but I think your view is that one area we don't need changes in is to have technology.
Yeah, it's technology-specific competition laws. Yeah. So as we did on a previous webinar, I think the ACCC and its recommendations in the 5th Digital Platform Inquiry Report go down the wrong path. I don't think we need, like Luke, I don't think we need industry-specific laws. We certainly shouldn't have laws banning or firms from merging or requiring that they face a different test when they merge. And again, it tends to reflect that gut reaction of, oh, there's something we don't like here, so we've got to try and hit that specifically. And I think we're seeing that around the world with technology platforms. You know, don't get me wrong, but technology platforms are not angels. They do a lot of things that I think are dubious. You know, I'll mention the Google shopping case in the EU, which you know, is a good example of behaviour that I would suspect would be an abuse of market power, at least on what I know of it. I wasn't involved in that case. The real concern is that we're seeing these calls in Australia for tougher laws when, you know, we probably have one of the toughest laws against abuse of market power currently in Australia. It's just hasn't been tested. So to say, well, we've got this tough law, oh, but it's not going to work over here. Well, guys, test it, run a case. There's been plenty of potential cases to run in Australia, which would have been good cases to run to get precedent, to find out the breadth of that law. But don't complain about the law not being broad enough before you've even tried it.
Thanks, Stephen. Now I'm going to go to the questions that we already have in the chat and from elsewhere. And please, others that are on the webinar, please pop your questions in the chat, because we've got just under 10 minutes for questions now. The first question goes back, Luke, to your comments around framing the conversation on data more around opportunities than risks. Interested in thoughts or reflections on what the role of government is here. There are risks associated with government appearing to pick winners. Who wants to go first on that one?
I'll let Luke go first. It was addressed to him.
I'm trying to remember. So what was the crux of the question again?
Well, the crux of the question, I think, is, and it's just gone
on data, yeah, more around.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's right. Well, I guess data is a broad topic, but yeah, there are lots of opportunities around data, and I guess like Stephen was saying that, I mean, a lot of companies are using data, but I guess and they are getting benefits from it, but I guess we don't really hear so much about that. And I think Stephen's point, I think is probably true, that we hear more about the negative side and not about the positive side. But I mean, the government does have a role in data. So I think this is from the PC's report. They mentioned it. Stephen, you could say what it is then, but you know, obviously the government's got to set up the infrastructure for data to be moved around. It's got to set the principles and the regulations about data being shared. So yeah, data is definitely a resource that is valuable. So if we could have rules that everyone understood and knew and could apply about how data could be shared, that would be helpful. So I guess it's like setting the boundaries, and then the government should step away.
Yeah, if I can just follow up on that. Yeah, if anyone hasn't read the PC's data report from 2017, I think, off the top of my head, so it might feel a long time ago now. Yeah, a lot of that was it led to the consumer data right, but a lot of it also looked at government data sets, and you'll see that a lot of that's repeated again in chapter 4 of our productivity review. Linking government data sets, making use of government data, having the government make use of government data, and I've mentioned that already, but also allowing government data to be linked in with private data to start creating value outside the government sector. And that can be, you know, again, health is just such an obvious example of where that can occur and where there's been some trials on it. But we had legislation passed, oh gosh, end of last year, might have been the end of the year before now, to bring that in. And unfortunately, it ended up that the data sharing got blocked. The legislation got changed. So the government data sharing can't go out to private firms, not just for profits, but not for profits as well. If there's the appropriate protections in place, then it's perfectly safe to allow that data sharing. And there's incredible opportunities for adding value and benefiting customers from that. The other one that I'd mention is the role of government interfaces. So we talk a lot about the ATO because it's simply best of practice in how to set up a system, which it did with one-touch payroll, not by saying the government is going to have the platform that delivers everything, but by saying, well, the government needs this bit of functionality, we will design that, but we will allow other platforms, other applications to hang off the government bit of the system. And that's exactly what Mind Your Own Business, it's exactly what Xero are doing. They have now become platforms for other service providers. So we're actually seeing a revolution in accounting and the way businesses are run, partly facilitated by the ATO with its one-touch payroll. If you look at our maritime report, you'll see it's the exact opposite on the docks. Our docks are slow and tedious, in part because we have paper-based border clearance forms still. And to the degree that we move to the so-called simplified trade system, it's not going to be linked in with anything else. So you've got those differences. There's a good way that government can do it, and unfortunately the government often decides, no, we're going to do the other way.
All right. Data seems to be of interest to our audience. We've got another question here for both Luke and Stephen. How can policymakers strike a balance between protecting individuals' data rights and enabling the efficient use of data for productivity gains? Are there any international examples of best practice that Australia can learn from in this regard? Who wants to go first? Do you want Luke, then Stephen? Or the other way around, whatever you like.
I don't know. I mean, Stephen probably knows more about this than me, but I mean, you would hope that the consumer data rights should be doing this. I mean, that's the sort of idea. I'm not really sure what the outcomes are for consumer rights so far. Is it, do you know, Stephen, is it having a positive effect that was sort of, it was supposed to have?
Yeah, so the consumer data right is having a lot less of an effect than everyone would hope. But it's being rolled out very well by Treasury. It was originally started off by rolling out industry by industry. Treasury is now thinking much more rolling it out by form of data, which I think is a better way of doing it. But again, these things tend to be slow burns. We're sometimes very impatient and sort of say, oh, we've had this change. Why haven't we seen a massive use of it over the last 6 or 7 months? Open banking in the UK is a better example where they introduced open banking. There's a lot of applications now hang off it. But I would notice what's happened there is they also have much stronger links in with the central bank in what you can do through using the open banking data. So Australia hasn't quite gone down that path and we haven't been as successful.
I mean, one other thing is like, I wonder whether in the question is like individuals' data rights. Like, have we agreed as a country what is, like, different people have different preferences, right, in regards to their data. So it's hard to say what the data right is for everyone. Some people want to be very private, other people don't.
Yep.
Yeah,
and I think, yep, sorry, on that, I mean, two things. I'll partly answer one of the other questions that popped up. A regime of data rights rather than thinking about it as data ownership, and privacy discussions often become back to data ownership, that an individual owns their personal data. Now, personal data is something that's incredibly hard to even define, far less say exactly who owns it. So rather than thinking about ownership, we need to think rights. The GDPR, so the General Data Protection Regime in the EU, is an ownership privacy-based regime. There has been work on the costs of the GDPR. I can't remember the exact name of the paper, but it's called something like, the land of lost applications, which just talks about the reduced innovation that has occurred in terms of development of applications in the EU due to the particular data rights that apply in the EU. Now, that's a topic for big discussion. One of the questions is, what about government data to be able to use for private business for any use? No, I'd start off initially having trusted private companies that show they can keep the data safe, that they can use the data. And then the Productivity Commission's original recommendation was there has to be a tangible public benefit from that use of data. So not simply, well, I can now shoot ads at people based on their medical records, but what we really want to see is that data, for example, and this has been done in a trial, for example, allowing private GPs to understand more about their population base and then to be able to use the data to provide better services for their clients. That's what we're really talking about.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I can see that we've just hit the 1:45 mark, which is our scheduled end of the webinar. So we might wrap it up there. I think it's a huge topic that we've covered today, or touched on a whole very broad range of things today, and the report is even broader. Would it be a fair summary, both of you, to draw from today's discussion that productivity is the result of a complex system? To the extent we've talked about regulation, regulation is something really which focuses on outcomes, and the Productivity Commission report talks a lot about systemic inputs that may need to be looked at by policymakers. Is it fair to say for both of you that regulation, and particularly focusing on competition regulation, is not the answer to the productivity question, and that policymakers should be focusing more broadly than that?
I'll jump in first if you like for once, Luke. I think that's exactly right, Kirsten. It doesn't mean that we don't need to think about what's happening to our competition law, to our competition institutions. We need to revisit Harper. We need to think about where there are changes that should be made. But they're, if you like, the regular ongoing maintenance that competition laws use. This failure of competition narrative, the idea that it's driving a reduction of living standards in Australia, I think is, Luke summarised it well, basically nonsense.
Did I say that? Okay, yeah.
You didn't say
That's
that.
right,
I'm
yeah.
summarising your summary.
Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, I mean, productivity is incredibly important and it's a huge challenge for the government. But there are lots of good ideas in the Productivity Commission's report. But yeah, looking at competition and regulation is not going to solve the productivity problem that we've got in Australia.
All right. Well, on the positive side of things, the report has lots of 71 recommendations, did you say, Stephen? 74 perhaps? Yep. Recommendations that perhaps will go some way to solving the productivity problem. So that seems to be where the focus should be. Thank you both very much and thank you audience, everyone in the audience, for joining what's been a super interesting discussion that could go on for a really long time. But we'll have to leave it there and look forward to discussing these issues with you again sometime, hopefully.
Thanks,
Thank you very much. Thank you.